Hello everybody, welcome back to March Mixing Madness. Today we're going to talk about the EQ. And actually I kind of rushed to record this video because I was actually in the mix. You can see the mixing project that I'm working on here. You can see that it's still in mixing mode in the sense that I have my mixing window in a different window here on my second monitor, which normally when I'm making content, I have it right over here. So you can see that I was still really into the mixing process. And the reason why I stopped the mixing process and why I decided to actually start recording was of what happened with this EQ and the really cool realization that I made about one of the most commonly used techniques for EQing. Now, I think I may have had a short about this a long time ago, and I've talked about this technique before, why I'm not really a fan of it. And when it comes to the technique, it's really about when you're trying to hone in on the frequency to EQ and trying to find which exact frequency you want to either boost or cut. What a lot of people tend to do is they just play their sound and then they go through it with an EQ band. So like this. And I believe in that last video, I talked about mainly the idea that going through it, you're going to naturally resonate any frequency that you're going to be selecting here. So any sound that is playing over here is naturally going to be resonant because it's being boosted in this resonant peak. So it's not a good technique for finding resonances, but I'm also going to make the argument that it's not even a good technique to finding the frequency that you want to affect. And that actually has to do with this EQ cut over here. If I quickly disable this, you can hear that the bassline has a little bit of like lower mid grittiness, which is not really what I wanted. And what I found is that when I was actually searching for, okay, which frequency is causing the sounds that I don't want, there wasn't any individual frequency that was doing it. So I was going like this. And I was just not finding the actual sound that I was hearing when this thing was turning off. And the reason for that is, it only really becomes apparent if you start selecting with a boost like this. I bet now you can hear it too. Kind of a little bit of a low mid kind of nastiness just in there, just like that boxiness and all of that stuff. That really comes from the frequency area and not really the frequency itself. Now, that doesn't mean that finding a frequency like this is never going to work, that it's never doing anything for you. It's just that this usually is a nice guide to find the frequency that you're going for, a nice starting point to find like the frequency area that you're going for. And then you have to narrow it down to the specific frequency area. So in my case, what I concluded was like, okay, if it's not any of the individual frequencies that I'm hearing, then it must be the whole thing. And therefore I decided to go with a much wider Q on this than if you were to just like EQ an individual frequency. I think you guys have seen this before where you make just a very narrow band and you just go down or up like this. Which again, that can be a very useful technique to do that, but it's really like exceptional that, in my opinion at least, that you find a problem within the mix where you actually have to be so surgical and so precise within the frequency region. It is usually the frequency area that you're trying to affect. And therefore, what I would recommend for those that are looking into mixing their own stuff and they are still having trouble with finding the frequencies that they want to affect with their EQ is not to look for it like this, but to look for it, say, like this. So that's going to be the main tip of this video. I do quickly want to say, if you'd like what I'm doing with this mixing stuff and you want to have your tracks mixed by me, that is possible, that is doable. You can just go to my website and check out my prices. And of course, while I have you here, while I have you in this little promo thing, make sure that you're subscribing, liking, commenting, all of that good stuff. Now let's get back into some more tips. Because I do have one more thing that I want to show. And this is something I've talked about before, but it's the plugin Transgressor. And what I want to, again, highlight about this particular plugin is the way that it has the release, where you can just set up the release however you want. Because I've seen a lot of transient versus sustain EQs available, but you're not able to determine kind of the crossover between, okay, when is the transient starting and when is the sustain starting. But with this hold and release, you can actually dial in very specific timings for this. And you can hear what a massive difference this is going to make. turning up the hold to 1 second to just simulate everything being a transient basically. And of course the hold is going to hold the transient level at this level, and the release is going to kind of crossfade between the transient EQ and then the sustain EQ is going to come in like this. So as you can imagine, you're kind of crossfading between two different EQ curves. And what I'm actually doing with this plugin is I'm trying to enhance the click a little bit, as you can see, but I'm mainly, again, trying to get some grittiness out of the actual bassline. So without it, it is maybe a little bit extreme the way that I've set it up. I could either fix that by turning up the release so that it takes a longer time for this EQ curve to actually fade in, and therefore it's going to affect it less. Or of course I could just alter the EQ curve and turn this up by a couple of dB so that it's less aggressive. But you can hear what I'm trying to affect here with that kind of grittiness and trying to get that out as much as possible. And yes, I'm still in the preliminary phase of my mixing stage, so you can see most of my tracks are still muted here, and I still have to actually add those to the mix itself. But I already know, just listening to the kick and bass, like, okay, the kick and bass, the way that it's going to shape like this, I'm gonna have a really hard time putting in all of the other things that I need to put into this mix. Because you can imagine the mid-range is really where everything kind of combines. You're going to have the very lowest frequencies of some of your really high elements, like your top drums and that kind of stuff. There's usually still a little bit of it left in the mid-range. There's going to be percussions there, there's going to be effects there, there's going to be sequences there. But of course also the kick and bass is very strong in the mid-range. And it still has to be very strong in the mid-range. You just want to push it down as much as you can get away with. Not really trying to get all of the warmth out of it, but you just want to leave yourself enough space that all of the rest can really fill up that space. And the exact way that you're going to do that is going to depend. I'm probably going to have to go back in both of the EQs that I've shown in today's video later on in the mixing process. But for now, I'm just dialing in the preliminary setting that I can use to then throw all of the other things in there, throw all of the other sequences in there. And of course, once I've done that, then it's time to actually get into the actual final mix. What I'm working on right now is just getting all of the draft mixes out there. I want to go through the entire album and do all of the draft mixes first before I go into any of the detailed mixes, such that I can use some of the information that I gather about the actual tracks that I have, about the actual draft mixes that I have, to further my mixing decisions moving forward with this project. Because of course, one of the things that you have to take into account in a mix like this for an entire album is that everything kind of has to sound the same sonically. You cannot have a track that is 4 dB heavier in the bass than the next track, which is going to be 4 dB heavier in the high frequencies, and then the next track is going to be very mid-range focused. You cannot really have that. You have to kind of keep a nice spectral balance throughout the entire album. So you can imagine that trying to actually achieve that, it means that you have to do things in multiple different stages. We just add everything to the initial mix, and then we compare all of the initial draft mixes together, and then we see, okay, maybe one of them has a little bit too much bass, one of them maybe has a little bit too much mid-range, and then I go in and fix all of that stuff, and then just continue doing that for a couple of iterations until I get my final mixes. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about in today's video. If you did enjoy this, let me know by leaving a like, and once again, make sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel, as I said before, is to make use of my mixing services, which you can find over on projectorsounds.com. There you can also find all of my products with links to all of the stores where I sell. So if you check that out, thank you, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.